The morning of my daughter's wedding, I was standing outside the bridal suite with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. I remember thinking that my father would have loved this moment. He never got to see me build what I built. He died the year I opened my second location, back when I was still sleeping 4 hours a night and eating lunch, standing over a desk. He would have put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Raymond, you did good." I would have given anything to hear that. Instead, I stood there in a rented hallway of the Harrington Inn, 63 years old, watching sunlight come through a window at the end of the corridor, and feeling something close to complete. My daughter was inside getting her hair done. My son-in-law's family had flown in from Phoenix. 220 guests were already claiming seats in the garden downstairs. I had paid for the flowers, the catering, the photographer, the string quartet. I had paid for the dress. I had done it gladly. My daughter was the kind of person who made you want to do things gladly. My son was a different story. I should have known that before that morning. Looking back now, I can trace the signs the way you trace cracks in a wall after the ceiling falls. Obvious in hindsight, invisible when you were living inside it. But that morning, I did not know. That morning, I was just a father with cold coffee and a heart too full to hold it all. I was walking back toward the elevator when I heard his voice coming from the small alcove near the ice machine. He was on the phone. His voice was low, but not low enough. The way people talk when they think they're alone in a hotel hallway at 9 in the morning. I stopped. I don't know why I stopped. Some instinct. Some small cold thing that moved through me before my mind caught up. "It's already done," my son said. "He signed the papers last month. I told you, once the business transfers, it's just a matter of time before we restructure and push him out. He thinks this is a retirement gift. He has no idea." I stood there. I did not move. No, he won't fight it. That's the thing about my father. He trusts everyone. 40 years in business, and the man still believes people mean what they say. It's almost sad. He laughed. He actually laughed. "After today, the company belongs to us. He can go enjoy his garden, or whatever it is old men do." I walked back to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed. The coffee cup was still in my hand, and I set it down on the nightstand without looking at it. I sat there for a long time while the sounds of the hotel moved around me, a cart rolling down the hallway, voices from the room above, somewhere distant, a door closing. I had built Callaway Home Services from nothing. I started it 31 years ago with a used truck, a pressure washer I bought on credit, and a list of 12 potential clients I had written by hand on a legal pad. By the time my son graduated college, we had 400 employees across 3 states. By the time he came to work for me, we had 800. I had spent 5 years teaching him the business. I had spent those 5 years believing I was passing something down. What I was actually doing, apparently, was handing over the keys to someone who had been counting the days until I was no longer useful. I thought about my father again. I thought about what he would have said. Then I dried my face, put on my jacket, and went downstairs to walk my daughter down the aisle. The ceremony was beautiful. My daughter cried. I cried. Her new husband looked at her like she was the only thing in the room, and I believed him, and I was grateful. During the reception, I danced with her, and she put her head on my shoulder the way she did when she was 7 years old, and I thought, this is real. Whatever else is happening, this is real. My son gave a toast. He talked about family and legacy and the values our father had instilled in him. He looked directly at me when he said it. I raised my glass. I am not a man who makes decisions in anger. I learned that lesson early, in the first years of the business, when I almost lost a major contract because I fired a project manager on the spot after he cost us a client. I had to spend 3 months rebuilding that relationship, and it taught me something I never forgot. The response you make in the heat of the moment is almost never the right one. You wait. You think. You choose the ground you want to fight on. So I waited. For 6 days after the wedding, I said nothing. I went to work. I had breakfast with my son on Tuesday morning the way we always did, at the diner on Clement Street where they knew our order before we sat down. I listened to him talk about Q3 projections and a new contract in Raleigh. I watched his face. I looked for the person I had raised, and I found pieces of him in there, buried under something I couldn't quite name. Ambition, maybe, or fear, or whatever it is that makes a person decide that love is a liability. On Thursday, I called my attorney, Daniel, who had been my attorney for 22 years and who I trusted completely. I told him what I had heard. I told him what I wanted to do. He was quiet for a moment. "Raymond," he said. "The papers he's referring to, the transfer agreement you signed last month, that's a conditional transfer. The conditions haven't been met yet. We have a window." "How long?" 60 days before it becomes irrevocable. I had 53 days. "I want to restructure," I said. "Before the window closes, I want options." Daniel told me what was possible. I listened. And then I did something I had not done in 31 years of business. I put the future of the company I built into a structure my son could not touch. I also decided to talk to him, not because I owed it to him. I want to be honest about that. Part of me, a part I'm not proud of, wanted to simply let the restructuring happen without a word. Let him discover what he'd lost only when it was already gone. That would have been easier, cleaner. No conversation, no confrontation, no risk of saying something I couldn't take back. But I kept thinking about something Daniel said when I was leaving his office. He said, "Whatever you decide, Raymond, you have to be able to live with it in 10 years. And I thought about sitting across from my son at that diner for the rest of my life, knowing I had never once looked him in the eye and told him what I knew. That felt like its own kind of dishonesty. So I called him on Friday evening and asked him to come to the house. He arrived at 7. He was wearing the same jacket he wore to my birthday dinner 2 years ago, the one I bought him. I noticed things like that, I realized. I had always noticed things like that. We sat in the study. I had poured 2 glasses of water. I had not poured whiskey because I wanted us both completely clear. I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting. Can you do that?" He nodded, slightly wary. I told him what I had heard. Every word. I had written it down the morning after the wedding so I would not misremember, and I told it back to him now without embellishment and without accusation in my voice. Just the words, just what was said. The color left his face. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he started to speak, and I heard the beginning of an explanation, forming a context, a misunderstanding, something, and I raised one hand. "I'm not finished." He stopped. I told him about the restructuring. I told him that the conditional transfer was being revised. I told him that, as of the previous afternoon, the company was no longer transferable under the terms he had been expecting. He sat very still. "Now I'm finished," I said. "You can talk." What came out of him was not what I expected. I expected anger. I had prepared for anger. I had even prepared, quietly, for him to get up and leave. What I did not prepare for was watching my son put his face in his hands like a boy who had just broken something irreplaceable and knew it. He didn't cry. He just sat there with his face covered for a long moment, and when he took his hands away, his expression was something I had never seen on him before. It was shame, pure, unguarded, nowhere to put it. "I don't know how to explain it," he said. "I don't know that I can. Try." He talked for almost an hour. He talked about the years he spent feeling like the company came first. Before him, before our family, before everything. He talked about a conversation he'd had with an old college friend who had inherited his family's business and convinced him that waiting for a father's timeline was a fool's game. He talked about his wife's pressure, about debt I didn't know about a version of events he had constructed in his own mind where I was the obstacle rather than the foundation. None of it excused what he said. He knew that. He said it himself. "I've been telling myself a story about you for 2 years, he said. And I knew on some level it wasn't true. I knew it every time I sat down to breakfast with you. I just kept choosing the story anyway because it was easier than admitting what I actually was. I looked at my son for a long time. He was 34 years old. He had my father's hands and his mother's stubbornness, and somewhere underneath everything that had happened in the last 2 years, he was still the boy who used to follow me around job sites asking questions about everything, who wanted to know how pressure washers worked and why some concrete stained and some didn't, who fell asleep in the truck on the way home from long days and never once complained. I did not forgive him that night. I want to be clear about that. Forgiveness is not a switch. It does not flip because you decide to flip it. What I did that night was something smaller and more precise. I decided not to close the door. I told him I was putting a new structure in place. Under the new arrangement, he would remain VP of operations, his role, his salary, his responsibilities, but the ownership structure would be held in a trust that I controlled until specific conditions were met over an 18-month period. Not 6 months. 18 months. And not just time passing, but milestones. Specific, documented, measurable milestones, client retention numbers, employee satisfaction reviews, 2 successful contract expansions in new markets, and a quarterly review with Daniel present where we assessed his decisions against the company's long-term interests. I told him that if he met those conditions, the trust would convert. Full ownership, as intended. His company, as I had always planned. I told him that if he did not meet them, or if I discovered any further attempt to undermine the company or my position, the trust would dissolve, and the company would be transferred to a charitable foundation I had already designated. He listened to all of it without interrupting. "And if I say no?" he asked. "Then you say no," I said. "I'll accept your resignation with a fair severance and we'll go our separate ways. I'll miss working with you, but I will not spend another year pretending I don't know what I know." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I want to try. If you're willing to let me." I told him I was willing. He stood to leave, and at the door he turned around, and for a moment he looked young, not like a VP, not like a man who had been calculating the terms of his father's exit, but like someone standing at the very beginning of understanding how much he had nearly thrown away. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. "I know," I said. "Go home. Get some sleep. We start Monday." The next 18 months were not easy. I want to say that plainly because I think when people tell stories like this, they often skip over the hard part, the part that isn't dramatic, the part that's just grinding work and slow, incremental proof. There were weeks where I watched him, and I still felt the cold thing move through me the way it had in that hotel hallway. There were quarterly reviews where Daniel would look at the numbers and then look at me, and I knew we were both aware that the story was still being written. Trust is not rebuilt in a single conversation or a single gesture. It is rebuilt in 10,000 small moments that accumulate into something solid enough to stand on. But the milestones came. The first quarter he hit his retention numbers and came in with a client expansion in Charlotte that nobody had expected, that he had pursued on his own initiative without telling me until it was done. He put the report on my desk and left without making a speech about it, and I thought, that is what I taught him. That is the part of him that was always real. The employee satisfaction numbers turned around in the second quarter. He reorganized the crew scheduling system after spending 2 weeks actually working alongside our field teams in Raleigh, something he had never done before, something that cost him nothing but time and humility. 3 crew leaders sent me separate messages saying they didn't know what had changed with him, but they hoped it lasted. I kept those messages. I still have them. In the third quarter, he came to me about the debt. He laid it out clearly, the amount, the terms, how it had happened, what he had already paid down, what remained. He did not ask me to fix it. He just said, "I think you should know." That was the moment something shifted between us. Not because the debt mattered to me, I had suspected it. I could have managed it easily, but because he chose to bring it to me voluntarily, rather than carrying it as a secret leverage. He chose transparency when hiding would have been easier. That, for me, was the milestone that mattered most. Not a number on a spreadsheet. That, when the 18 months ended, I sat in Daniel's office with my son on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The windows faced the bay, and the light was coming in at a low angle the way it does in fall, throwing long shadows across the conference table. Daniel went through the assessment. My son had met every condition. Not barely clearly. Daniel slid the final transfer documents across the table. I looked at my son. He looked back at me, and there was no calculation in his face. There was something else. Something that looked a lot like the expression he'd had that night in the study, except quieter, more settled. I picked up the pen. I have thought many times about what would have happened if I had simply let the anger lead. If I had responded in those first days the way part of me wanted to, burning it down, cutting him out, choosing punishment over process. I could have done it. I had every right. What I would have lost, though, is harder to name. Not the company, which would have survived either way. But whatever it is that exists now, when my son comes to my house for breakfast on Tuesday mornings and we talk about the business as equals, when I watch him make a decision I would have made and feel something that I think my father would have recognized, something that doesn't have a simple word but feels like continuation. Last month he called me on a Sunday morning. His daughter, my granddaughter, 11 months old, currently the most important person in my life, had said something that sounded almost like Grandpa, and he wanted me to hear it on the phone. I stood in my kitchen in my slippers, listening to an 11-month-old make sounds that may or may not have been my name. I thought about that hallway in the Harrington Inn. I thought about cold coffee and a window at the end of a corridor, and a morning when I thought my world was complete, and then 60 seconds later, discovered it was not. I thought about my father, who never got to hear his name in a granddaughter's voice. I have learned that betrayal is rarely the whole truth about a person. This does not mean you accept it or excuse it or pretend it didn't happen. It means you make a decision with your eyes open, with the facts in front of you, with your self-respect intact about what you want the rest of the story to be. I am 63 years old. I built a company from a used truck and a credit card and a list of 12 names. I walked my daughter down the aisle on a morning that broke me and rebuilt me before noon. I sat across from my son at the worst and best moments of our relationship and did not flinch from either. I don't know what my father would say about all of it, but I think he would have put his hand on my shoulder. I think he would have said, "Raymond, you did good." And for the first time in a long time, I believe he would have been right.